So first of these, probably the least famous, arguably maybe with along the third one. I think second and third ones are pretty famous. Alfred the Great. So just why you should love him, just straight off the bat, just because of sheer badassery and determination and willpower against quite a lot of crappy things that happened to him. Really, so Alfred the Great's a great read or a great watch. A few years going back in the day, he was remembered for burning the cakes. That's like the main thing that people associate with him. But he actually did quite a lot of cool stuff. So very important in the formation of the unified English kingdom. So not to get too bogged down in one character or just talking about one man's events here, but he is as cool as he is because he was the Anglo-Saxon leader that successfully fought back, at least initially, against the Great Heathen Army. The Great Heathen Army was the Viking conquerors that landed in East Anglia initially in 865 and eventually led to Alfred and his older brother in 870 into 871 fighting the Vikings in Wessex. So back then, England was just like a patchwork of different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In the south, you had the Kingdom of Wessex and Mercia, the famous Middle Kingdom, which is the one where Offa comes from. So you have that famous king of the Midlands region, Mercia, called Offa. Northumbria, another major kingdom, and then East Anglia. Those were the four major kingdoms of the time. And Alfred, as the name of the television program implies, become the king of the last kingdom, the last free kingdom, to fight the Vikings, the Great Heathen Army, as it was known. Usually just Viking is a term that's not probably wasn't used that much at the time. They're probably heathens, Danes, pagans, those kinds of terms would have been used. But yeah, Alfred was balls deep in that, to use a bit of a bit of a weird term. But yeah, so he just in terms of there was so much going against Alfred right from the offset. So he wasn't really meant to be king. He was the last son of Ethelwulf, who was the king of the West Saxons from 839 to 858. And he was the son of Egbert, who was Alfred's grandfather, who was the first of the house. And he was never really supposed to be king. It was fairly unlikely that he'd be king. Alfred was born about 848. Scholars usually pick that year, although there are outliers. Some choose 847, 849, that kind of period. So he was the last son of the King of Wessex, and he was essentially the last man standing out of the brothers as well. So there was a quick succession of Ethelwulf's sons to the throne. Ethelbald only ruled for like 2 years from 858 to 860. He's a fairly interesting chap. He married Ethelwulf's wife, who was his stepmother, which is a bit weird. Lots of cool stories period as well. But yeah, you had Ethelbald for 2 years, then Ethelbert, who reigned from 860 to 865, and then eventually you had Ethelred, who you actually see if you watch the Last Kingdom. You do actually see Ethelred depicted. He was the next eldest son, and then eventually you get to Alfred, who takes over in the dark days of early 871. By that point, he was always neck deep in events. So it's just the sheer someone like that I really admire because it's just the sheer willpower of the guy. It obviously helps that I live and was brought up in Wessex as well. So, I'm a Pompey guy. So I was born and bred in Portsmouth in the south. So that's just a few miles south of Winchester itself, the ancient capital of the Kingdom of Wessex. So a lot of famous sites are quite close by to me. Incidentally, there's a call. Bosham is fairly close by, which is quite cool. That was the old Godwinson one of the Godwinson bases, Harold Godwinson of 1066 fame. Obviously Winchester. I've actually been to Winchester a few times. You see the old statue of Alfred with the sword, which is pretty cool. Winchester's quite hilly. I remember doing a 10k run there once, so it's quite cool. It's very old. It's one of those places. It's a bit, obviously not to the same extent, but I've been to Rome as well when I was a lot younger with my college, and it's a shadow of that kind of feeling. It's just history just seeps into you as you're walking around. Winchester's a bit like that. You can feel that it's old. You can get that ambiance, if that's even the right word, that Rome is very much overwhelming, especially if you're historically sort of interested like I am anyway. So Winchester's a bit like that. But yeah, it's just, Alfred is just, he is a badass, not necessarily because he was just rampaging around killing Danes in these battles. It's more, and we'll get to the next character who I want to touch upon, so I don't want the video to last hours on end, but he's got a lot in common with the next figure that I admire as well for similar reasons, because he wasn't what you would necessarily think of in terms of a man of that era and rank. You usually get images, although he's the most famous example of a person of that era. But Alfred was quite a weedy dude. He wasn't, I know I don't look particularly weedy, I just look normal, but Alfred was the youngest son, and it's fairly obvious, in my opinion, that he was meant for the church. So he went on pilgrimage to Rome quite famously when he was very young, so about 4 or 5, twice technically. So he was sent before Ethelwulf went on his own pilgrimage to Rome, and then he went to Rome himself, which kind of makes it seem he might have been destined for the church, which is quite common for younger sons. Although he was an atheling, that is throne worthy, kind of in the line of succession, but not really. He was kind of like a Prince Harry of his time or something. he was there, but at that point, in his youth, he was never going to be king. It was very unlikely. There were at least Ethelwulf's eldest son, Alfred's oldest brother, died quite young, but at that point in his youth, there were still 3 brothers ahead of him, and it wasn't certain at that time that they were going to randomly drop dead as they did. Yeah, so he was never meant to be king. He wasn't really built to be a king, even though he fought these bruising battles. I think something ridiculous like 9 battles Alfred, or the West Saxon Fyrd, I should say, fought in just a few months. So it was like the end of 870. I think you had the Battle of Englefield at the very tail end of 870. It's like New Year's Eve or something. And then you get several more battles in the early year of 871, and they're just completely battered. And you imagine this sort of weedy, monkish type dude. Probably didn't relish it that much, but was a man very much duty bound and felt a need to get involved. And he was, but at that point as well, by that point, he was very much in the line of succession. So this is a guy that's not necessarily built for the task, but take up the task he did. Famously proved his badassery in the Battle of Ashdown, which was early on in 871, where he held the 2 Viking columns. There was 2 of them coming towards him. They were heading towards the high ground. This was sort of northwest of Reading, just northwest of Reading, near the Thames, which is one possible location of the Battle of Ashdown. But he basically held the line on some high ground when there was 2 the Vikings had split themselves up, and they were heading towards him. But Ethelred, the king at the time, hadn't joined the battle yet. So Alfred was like, oh shit, we better hold the line here. So it's just the balls of the guy. He's just like, screw this. And even though he's not necessarily, like I say, this weedy, monkish kind of guy, just didn't really give a shit. And he just thought, well, got to do what I got to do. Probably not the best guy for the time, although ironically, as it turns out, he was a very good guy for the time, but just got on with it. And yeah, that's one reason why I really love Alfred. He's just this not really fitted to his time, but then so fitted to the time as well. It's kind of like a weird paradoxical thing going on there. And yeah, eventually, obviously, it went even worse than that. So Ethelred won the Battle of Ashdown with Alfred, and they were battered in a few other battles. So you had the Battle of Basing after that, which was a defeat against the Great Heathen Army, and then you had another battle, Meriton, which was a defeat as well. West Saxons got a bit battered there as well, and Ethelred was thought to have been mortally wounded there, and that's why you got Alfred. That's Alfred's unlikely succession in 871 as King of Wessex, and it's a good thing too. Now we know, of course, that it was a good thing because several years later, although there was a breathing period, so to speak, although the Danes and the Vikings themselves were still around in Britain, and I say Britain because it wasn't just Anglo-Saxon lands, they were also ravaging the Welsh, they were in Francia, they were in Pictish land, they were everywhere. It was like a blitzkrieg of the time, like a blitzkrieg of longships. So Alfred fell much lower than that, and it really shows the measure of the man. So this is what I refer to as the time in 878, so late 877, the winter time of that period. That was the famous Chippenham attack. So where Guthrum, the guy who took over from the leaders that fought the West Saxons at Ashdown in that kind of period. So this is several years later. Guthrum swept into Wessex and took Chippenham and drove Alfred out. And this is like the rock bottom nadir of West Saxon fortunes. So at that point, arguably, Guthrum and the Danes had free run of Wessex, and they were pretty much screwed, at least on paper. And so you can't really get that much lower. I was tossing up in my head whether or not to make it 4 characters, but I think the video would just be too long. The reason for the 4th is a very similar figure, perhaps more famous too, Robert the Bruce. Very similar path. He reached a nadir as well, where he was pretty much fucked. He become. It was a bit more dramatic in terms of time scales with Robert the Bruce, because he become King of Scots in 1306, and then very quickly he lost a battle and was driven into exile in a similar way. Although with Alfred it was more of an internal exile. So that's where you get the famous period where he's in Athelney in the Fens region of Somerset. And that's where you have Alfred the Bandit at his lowest ebb. And that's where you get the story of burning the cakes. It's first seen, I think, Saint Neot. Probably butchered that pronunciation, but that's where the story's first seen. And you get the famous, the lowest of the low bit where the peasant, the wife of the swineherd, this peasant woman, allows Alfred to sort of put his feet up in the hut for a while he's sort of resting from attacking like local Viking patrols, and he allows these cakes to burn because he's so consumed in the troubles that he's having at the time. And so he gets this scolding from a lowly peasant woman, so the lowest you can get. And yet from that low, just a few months later, it's a dramatic turnaround where you get the mustering of the men, or many men I should say, of Hampshire, Somerset, and obviously like Dorset as well, mustered together at Egbert Stone, the famous Egbert Stone near Selwood. And then you get the subsequent Battle of Ellington, where Alfred batters the Viking forces under Guthrum. Probably at Bratton Camp. That's where a lot of scholars I've looked into this quite a bit. Bratton Camp, which is sort of near modern day Eddington. It's either there or Eddington Hill. But anyway, that's where things decidedly looked up for Alfred. He's a very colourful figure, and probably the least well known of the three, although he's still very famous, obviously. But out of the three guys I'm talking about, and they are guys, unfortunately. But I might do a video on women that I admire and why you should love them in a different video. It wouldn't be very hard for me to do, because there are certainly people I'd like to look into there. But yeah, he's just a very interesting. Must have had, again, very similar to not just the second guy who we'll get to in a minute, but also the third guy. He must have had some kind of charisma going on to even at his lowest ebb as he was, to manage to muster that support of all of those people, even as low as he was, just to keep battling on, just to say, screw it, I may be being scolded by some peasant woman in a hut in the middle of some swamp, but I'm just going to keep hammering on. And the other thing to mention about it as well is, not only that's not bad enough, the guy was like constantly sick as well. He was just, there was something wrong with him. I think the modern diagnosis is usually he had Crohn's disease, so he had something weird sort of stomach condition, and it was with him forever. Basically, he had it since he was a kid. So not only is he not really martial type to begin with, he's very bookish. He's as famous as a scholar to historians and to historically interested people as he is as a king. He wrote a lot of stuff, and he was a smart guy. So not only was he not built into that mold in the first place, but the poor guy was probably suffering quite bad. He was probably in constant pain all the time. So it's just, yeah, it goes to show what people can do, even when they're, I don't know, he was a king and everything, and relatively speaking, he was dealt a good hand, but in terms of the club of kings, if you like, he had a pretty crappy hand, and he still played it really well. Goes to show what one man can do if they got the tools, so to speak, and can play the game well, even with a crappy hand. But yeah, the reason why you should love him, and why I think he's great, because literally great. Didn't mean to do that then, but the pun unintended, but a happy coincidence. But the reason why he is great is because just sheer badassery, and just what's not to admire about someone like that, even if you just take away the context of a sort of a rich Anglo-Saxon dude. It's just a cool story. And yeah, Alfred the Great, look into it. So the next guy, you definitely know, Julius Caesar, or Gaius Julius Caesar. Might get an eye roll from a few people, because he obviously is incredibly famous, and I said earlier on, the greatest Roman of them all. I mean, come on, he's got to be, hasn't he? I think I wouldn't be being honest if I didn't put him in at least an initial list of historical figures that I really love, and that I think you should love too. It's just the immensity of the guy. So he is one of those people. So I can think of a couple of others right now. Actually, I can think of three others. So Napoleon's definitely one of them. So you have this great man theory of history. He definitely belongs in that camp. So he is one of the great men of history, and it's hard to sort of argue against that. So Caesar, incredibly influential, conquered Gaul. I'll just give you a quick. I mean, I'll be surprised if you didn't know something about Caesar. Obviously, you will, because if you've clicked on this video, you're historically interested and you're slightly curious as to what me as a rando dude thinks is a great historical figure. But Caesar was a great figure in the late Republic era of Roman history, and he was the conqueror of Gaul. So he conquered Gaul in the Gallic Wars from 58 BC onwards, and eventually, given he had some shady dealings, let's say, during his year of the consulship, he's got his first consulship, I should say, in 59 BC, did a lot of shady things to pass some laws, because Caesar managed to pass some land reforms, badly needed land reforms, during his time as consul, and he also managed to get some things done for Pompey and for Crassus at the time. By the way, this is the whole first triumvirate thing. So you have these three great men who politically team up, and then Caesar runs for and then achieves the consulship in 59, and they all work together politically and basically dominate the late Republic. But he did a lot of shady stuff. So I think one thing was technically it's give and take, but his enemies would say that he incited violence against a fellow consul. Just if you don't know, in the Roman world, the prime minister or the equivalent or the president, if you like, was the consul, and there were two of them. So Caesar had a fellow consul during his term, as all consuls did. You had two consuls. And he was a political opponent, so he was an ideological opponent. He was called Bibulus, and he was a conservative politician, whereas Caesar was what was called a populares, who was, at least on paper, a champion of the people, the plebs, and he would. Caesar, at least, and others of his ilk would tend to try and get round the Senate, because the Senate were more for the rights of the Senate itself, or the aristocracy, whereas people like Caesar were more populist, which is hence the similarities of the terms. But yeah, he did a lot of shady things. Technically, probably incited violence against Bibulus. I think Bibulus had a load of shit dumped on his head because he was against some of Caesar's reforms and was trying everything he could to block it. And people who obviously supported Caesar and the land reforms didn't like that. So that was one thing, among other things, that Caesar did wrong. So Caesar was in trouble with the Senate, and there were many people that wanted to prosecute him. So that was the whole beginnings of the controversy with Caesar. And the guy, it'd just be very difficult to go into too much depth without the video becoming hours long and without doing a shit ton of research. But basically, he was an opponent of most of the Senate, or at least the conservative wing of the Senate. After his term as consul, he ended up as proconsul, as they called it, of Gaul. I say Gaul, it was technically 3 provinces. It was Illyricum, Transalpine, and Cisalpine Gaul. It was sort of the north of Italy. And he used these 3 provinces and the resources of those 3 provinces to launch his famous Gallic Wars. Another cool thing, which he kind of has in common with Alfred, did a lot of writing himself. He was a bit of a scholar. Caesar was a bit of a writer as well, so a bit of an understatement, but he wrote the famous commentaries on the Gallic Wars, which is why we know quite a bit about the Gallic Wars. The Gallic Wars, the most famous part of that is the whole battle towards the end of them with Vercingetorix, and you have the Battle of Alesia, where you have the donut fortifications surrounding the hill fort of Alesia. You have Caesar winning that battle against ridiculous odds, although there's another fun thing about Caesar. He tends to, a bit like Napoleon in that respect, there's just a thread little similarities between these people, but Napoleon was a bit of a self-publicist as well. And Caesar, I think partly, if not mostly, wrote these commentaries to blow his own trumpet, so to speak, and he would inflate numbers to that end. So Alesia, humongous battle. I think it was like 250,000 Gauls he claimed he was fighting against, or something. I think there was like 50,000 legionaries at the battle, or something crazy like that. Just, anyway, the Gallic Wars. Caesar did a load of stuff. He was just a guy who dominated his time in terms of his personality and his achievements and things. It's kind of like lots of different people rolled into one. So he was like, I don't know how to describe it. He's like a reporter extraordinaire. So he would come up with these crazy stories and write these commentaries. And it's not really known whether he published them all at once and then just released them, or whether they were like periodicals. So he'd just like write chapters and send them back to Rome. But you imagine being in Rome at the time, you'd hear these crazy stories from Caesar, and you can see why, even at the time, the man was regarded as special. He was regarded as like bigger than the other men of his time, which they didn't like very much. And just other things as well. So he was kind of like a scholar. He was a reporter. He was a general, obviously. In my opinion, this isn't. I've noticed in different places this isn't really the case with a lot of people. A lot of people put him near the top of the top generals, but they don't quite put him at the tip top. I think it's a bit unfair. I think he is one of the greatest commanders for what it's worth. I mean, I'm no bloody expert, but I think that as well, just on its own, he was a great military commander, and arguably, in my opinion, he was a better politician, if that's even possible. I mean, he was a master politician as well. So, and he was kind of like a pioneer of his time as well, just geographically and in terms of being an adventurer. So he was just this larger than life, humongous personality. He's often described as colossus, and it's not an understatement, even in his time. So I'll say like a pioneer adventurer type, because he did things that other people just hadn't done, and he would do things that other people either couldn't do or just wouldn't have thought to do. So a good example is, although it was Claudius much later on, a century later, that conquered Britain, Caesar had 2 campaigns in Britain. And back then, to the Mediterranean world, to the Roman world, Britain was like this weird place on the edge of the world. So there was some information about it, but not a lot. There wasn't much information. It was just this weird place on the periphery that no one had really gone to. There's scant information. A few Greeks maybe have traded there. It was known that there was a lot of tin in Cornwall and things like that, but it wasn't widely well known about as a place, let's say. So you kind of think of it. I think if you ever watch the podcast of Dan Carlin, I highly recommend them. You really need to watch them if you want an in-depth look into the Roman period, not just Caesar. He does go into Caesar, but the whole period. He talks about Marius, who's another figure like a couple of generations before, and then the Gracchi and things like that. But that's by the by. But I think he described it as sort of akin to in the 60s in our modern time, Neil Armstrong and Apollo 11 mission to the moon. It was just a thing that captivated people. And you imagine being in faraway Rome and just reading about Caesar going to this weird land where some people may not have thought it even existed. So that's how bizarre it was. And the other cool thing he at least people at the time would have thought was pretty cool was he crossed the Rhine as well. So not only was he fighting Gauls, he was also fighting Germans as well. So there was a dude called Ariovistus who was encroaching into, I think it's Sequani territory. It was one of the tribes, Gallic tribes, and he was encroaching into Gallic territory as well. And Caesar eventually come to blows with him as well, Caesar and his legions, and drove Ariovistus out. And later on, there was another Germanic incursion around about the time of the Britain campaigns, actually. And so Caesar, as a show of force, was the first to cross the Rhine, which the Germans were completely shocked, and people in Rome were shocked as well. I was like, bloody hell. Caesar constructed this bridge over the Rhine within a few days, and again another a feat of engineering, and just this shocking display of speed and coolness, for want of a better term. So yeah, he was a guy that just did things that weren't done, and just you wouldn't think so many deeds and so much life could be contained in one guy, which is why it's really hard for me and probably millions of other people not to admire him. That's not even touching, which I might do just quickly because the video is probably getting quite long. But it's not even touching on his skills as a general. So you could talk about Caesar without even touching on that necessarily too much. You could talk about his skills as a politician, as a publicist, as a personality. So he was very brave as well. So there was different stories of him just marching out into no man's land, getting these pila, the little spears, the Roman civil war. You just step out with a shield when the line was faltering. These troops would be like, what the fuck, like that. They'd just be exposed in the middle of nowhere. So he was no coward either. And I was saying earlier on how Caesar and Alfred were in the respect of their physicality, they were quite similar. Now, this isn't to say that either man was necessarily like a complete like wuss or anything like that. It's just that they weren't what you would normally think of as the martial type, and Caesar wasn't particularly of that ilk either, not really. So he was kind of a slender guy, not really what you would necessarily think a picture in your mind as a typical muscle sort of Roman general. And he too had ailments as well. So he famously suffered from epileptic fits, didn't he? I think he had a major fit during a battle during the Civil War, the Battle of Thapsus. He had a random epileptic fit which held up the whole battle. and the eventually the crazy thing about that was at the time is that the troops by that point in the Civil War had enough and they just charged off their own accord. But yeah, anyway, he had an Alfredian component to him, which should probably be vice versa given the chronology of events. But yeah, and just touching on the whole skills as general. See, this is the thing. A lot of people talk about this kind of thing in a very simplistic way. They kind of tend to think, oh wow, it's in terms of wins and defeats. I don't mean to be too harsh on some people, but it is a lot of the time you hear talk just dicking around with people and talking about it and just coming up with your own personal list of greats and stuff. And usually it's Alexander, never defeated in battle, and so that means he's the greatest of all time. Maybe. But then you have Napoleon Bonaparte, who's, I think mathematically there was some kind of system where they ranked the generals and he was on top, I think. But even though he lost, I think it was like half a dozen battles or something, although he won something crazy like 50 or something like that. So I don't necessarily think that defeats necessarily negate a commander's greatness or their effectiveness. Caesar lost battles. It's true. Hannibal, another great, lost the Battle of Zama, obviously, but won some stunning victories as well. Arguably the greatest victory, or one of the greatest victories against a Roman army at the Battle of Carnae. But you wouldn't knock him down too much for that. He's still in the top 5, in my opinion. It's arguable. It's a fun thing to debate about. Caesar lost battles, so he famously lost Gergovia against Vercingetorix in the Gallic Wars, and lost at Dyrrhachium against Pompey the Great during the Civil War in Greece. But then the key thing to understand is that, in my opinion, it's you probably guess what I'm going to say, but it's the downs. If you can get up after being knocked down like that, if you can rally and come back after defeats, then that shows a caliber that maybe has not been revealed in other commanders. So the fact that Alexander never really suffered a good beating, you could argue he did in India. He was pretty well mauled there, but he didn't suffer an outright defeat. Caesar did. I think there was that Raspina. I was trying to think of Raspina as well in Africa. So that was he was pretty mauled there as well against Labienus, his former lieutenant. So he suffered defeats, but the key thing is that he never just. It was never a case of him just collapsing and just saying, "Oh wow, I've been defeated. That's the war over. When's my trial going to start?" Kind of thing. He's just like, "No, screw this," and very Alfredian in that sense, or vice versa, as I said before. So, and I think that's the mark of a great commander, the fact you can bounce back like that and just. He was defeated at Dyrrhachium. I think he said he lost like 1,000 men, but it could have been worse. Dyrrhachium was kind of like this siege situation where they were trying to outflank each other with fortifications, and Pompey managed to force an engagement at a certain point, and Caesar's men panicked and ran. And Caesar himself said if Pompey had followed up the attack at Dyrrhachium, Caesar and his men would have been pretty screwed. So, but even with that, I mean, the guy still rallied, and pretty soon afterwards turned it round and won the Battle of Pharsalus, which was one of the turning points of the Civil War. So the Great Roman Civil War, as it's known. So yeah, in my opinion, that makes a commander greater, not lesser, with defeats. If you can have these defeats and bounce back. Jagovia is another one. So again, a panic type situation where you see Vercingetorix, his troops smash into Caesar's flank in the Battle of Jagovia. But again, it wasn't the end. It wasn't as existential a threat, perhaps, as Dyrrhachium later on. But yeah, with Jagovia, you eventually get Alesia, where Caesar seems to learn his lesson in a siege situation and builds these humongous fortifications facing inwards and outwards to contain Vercingetorix and keep out the Gauls in the surrounding hills. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about with Caesar, but in terms of why you should love him, I mean, how can you not? It's just, if you're even slightly historically interested, he's just this supernova of historicity that just blows up in like a blank space. It's hard not to love a character like that, for better or worse. I mean, the guy, I've said a few times to different people that a lot of these people that are admirable or are interesting, I mean, most of them are pretty unsavory dudes, but at the same time, they're bloody interesting. But yeah, Gaius Julius Caesar, and again, another one you've probably heard of, but definitely worth a very thorough looking into. And then finally, still probably not as famous as Julius Caesar, but still maybe slightly more famous. Depends. Let's just see. So the third one, Socrates. For me, Socrates always had a special place with me in my heart. Socrates, because you're going to be like, what the hell? But I grew up with Bill and Ted. So Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, one of my favourite films. Oh, at least when I was a little anyway. I haven't watched it in a few years. But you know, when you're a kid and you watch these films, you watch them dozens, if not hundreds of times. That movie definitely in one of the movies I watched the most, and Socrates introduced to me in that film. It's a great film in that respect, by the way. If you, it's getting on a bit now. Made in the 80s, Keanu Reeves, obviously. It's Alex Winter is the other dude, and they did a newer one recently. But yeah, Socrates, introduced in that along with other historical figures. I think they go. I think Napoleon's in it at one point. Which is kind of crazy, and Genghis Khan's there, Temujin, Genghis Khan, and Billy the Kid, and you have all these historical figures. So it's actually quite educational and quite clever if you think about it. It's maybe it's kind of seen as a bit goofy, that film, but Socrates is one of the best characters in that, and Socrates as a character is pretty cool as well in real life. So Socrates to me is just cool, and the reason why you should love him, just to directly answer the question, is that he was the guy that essentially opened up philosophy in its earlier days, at least Western philosophy in its earlier days, to the whole subject of morality. So talking about how people should act with each other, the whole question of morality and ethics. So he, in a different way to Alfred the Great and Gaius Julius Caesar, he's incredibly influential, at least in terms of thought and philosophy. And he was a very important guy, and he was the thing with Socrates. You got to remember with Socrates is he was kind of like the chief troll of his time. So he was an Athenian Greek. I think he died in 399 and was the teacher of Plato, and was, like I say, this troll-like figure who questioned the great and the good of the time in terms of what they and everyone else knew. So he would essentially go around the city and in the forum and talk to anyone who would listen and question people about different about different subjects, basically. So if just a very original thinker in that respect. So at the time, although this seems pretty mundane to us now, it's just like, well, so what? He goes around questioning people. Any 5-year-old kids can be annoying that way, but it's a bit different. So you're talking about a time period when, back in the day, when knowledge was much more confident. So people were much more confident in what they thought they knew. So there were answers to questions, or the gods would have the answers, or the elders would have answers to questions. So when you said something like, "What is courage?" there would be a preset answer that the elders would know, or your father would say, "Oh, courage is so and so," or the ability to endure hardship, or something like that. But then Socrates would be a pain in the arse, and he'd essentially break down the answers to these questions, not necessarily in a way to be a dick, although I suspect he may have gained some pleasure out of it, hence the troll aspect of my description before. But yeah, it's more for a pursuit of knowledge, so chipping away, if you like, of the excess stone to reveal the sculpture, to come up with an elaborate analogy there. But I think by the way, I think Socrates' trade may have been sculpting. It could have been, or was a stonemason or something. But anyway, yeah, he was. I think he described himself as the gadfly of the state. So he was this semi-humorous figure at the time. I think he was. He had the piss taken out of him in a play called The Clouds at the time by a dude called Aristophanes, and he was sort of seen as this clownish figure who would question everything, and he'd piss off these great people. So for example, he would ask a judge or someone of that ilk, who's obviously back then they were much more revered than they are today. He would ask someone like that, or the son of a judge or something like that, about what is justice, and then when the answers that they gave would be revealed to have a lot of holes in it and wouldn't necessarily be as airtight as people think, you'd gain some knowledge out of it, or at least you would eliminate what justice isn't. But then you piss off the people that you've questioned, and that you revealed the flaws in their arguments, and obviously no one likes to look like an idiot, do they? So it's kind of like, dude, what are you doing? And yeah, so Socrates spent a few years doing that in Athens. I think it's a Socratic method is the name of the term. So Socrates was this annoying to some and brilliant to others. One such person, another very famous person who would have been in the brilliant camp, was Plato, who was a follower of Socrates. And yeah, so you have a lot of what we know about Socrates, not exclusively, but a lot of what we know about Socrates is in the dialogues of Plato, who was arguably he was really, but he was Socrates' greatest student, and he wrote the dialogues, which usually have Socrates as the protagonist. And I think I'm right in saying that, I'm no bloody expert, but I think scholars tend to say that the earlier dialogues are probably not word for word true, but they're pretty accurate in terms of what Socrates thought, or maybe the ambiance of it, or if that's even the right word, of the whole philosophy of Socrates. The later ones, not so much so. I think that's more Plato maturing in his own philosophy, and so using Socrates more as a mouthpiece. We know Socrates actually, by the way, there's the whole thing of the Socratic problem, which is whether Socrates existed or how much of the real Socrates existed. I think he did exist, because there are other sources that refer to him. I think Xenophon is another big source, rather, which is how we know he existed, and also things like the Clouds that refer to Socrates. So yeah, he's just an interesting guy. And another one as well that isn't necessarily martial. So a lot of these figures, especially with dudes and younger guys, let's say, a lot of admirable people in terms of martial. So you have a Julius Caesar or a Hannibal or a Napoleon, politicians, people of that ilk. Whereas Socrates is an interesting one because he doesn't necessarily fit that mold. He's more of an intellectual hero, And yeah, another cool, let's say, interesting thing about Socrates is eventually, as you may expect, he pissed a lot of people off in terms of the elites of the time with his Socratic questioning. So he would show up a lot of people with his questioning and make them look a bit daft when their answers weren't necessarily as airtight as they thought on these different subjects. And so eventually he made quite a lot of enemies. Not the only reason, there are other reasons as well. Another thing about Socrates is he wasn't particularly a fan of democracy, which is controversial today. And so he made a lot of enemies in that, because Athens obviously one of, if not the cradle of democracy. There's arguments that democracy existed in some forms in India as well, which is why I say that. I don't believe that. I think it is the cradle of democracy, by the way. But yeah, he wasn't a fan of democracy either, and he was rightly or wrongly associated with the rule of an oligarchy for a brief period. And so he made a lot of enemies and eventually was put on trial for two charges in particular were levied against him. And the first was corrupting the youth of the city. So people looking at people like Plato may have agreed that he was corrupting the youth of the city. And the other was atheism, so not believing in the gods of the state as well. And those were the two charges on which Socrates was brought to trial. And the funny thing about Socrates is he was brought to trial, and he was found guilty of the charges. But when the procedure of it at the time was that the defendant would say, right, this is what punishment I should get, and then he would suggest it, and then the jury would then vote on the severity of the punishment. And I think the funny thing about it was Socrates said something crazy like, "Oh well, my questioning has made life better, or it's advanced knowledge a lot more than what there was before." So he thought he should be rewarded for his services to philosophy and to the people of Athens. And he said, I should get a pension and I should have a statue and crazy stuff like that. And it's probably done tongue in cheek, but knowing Socrates, it may not have been as well. But anyway, this pissed them off even more, because it was like an affront to the authority of the jury, the people there, and they actually voted in heavier numbers to punish him with the death penalty than they did to convict him in the first place, because there were separate votes on both the conviction itself and then and then the sentence. So that's the crazy thing. Little factoid about Socrates' trial was actually the vote was worse, so to speak, for his sentence than it was for the prosecution itself, so the guilty verdict itself, I should say. Yeah, the sad thing is Socrates was sentenced to death after being put on trial. And the cool thing is that this is the tragedy in my own very closeted view. I know this is very controversial, and this is a thing about me that a lot of you, we're all friends here, but then we can, be adults about it and say there's things about me that you might not like, and there's things about other people that I don't necessarily like, but we're still friends about it, and we still have a lot of fun and joke about it. But the tragic thing about Socrates is he still believed in the state, and that given that he was brought up by the Athenian state, and he saw it as being nurtured like a mother nurtures a babe. And so he felt that he couldn't go against the dictates and the decision of the Athenian state. And that's why, even though he could have escaped, and he was offered means of escape, and he could have just walked away, literally he was in like a room somewhere, and one of his friends came and said, look, just stand up, walk out the city limits, and we'll get you a place in the countryside and you can live out the rest of your days there. He was a little old guy by the time. If you watch Bill and Ted, that I referred to earlier, you'll see he's like a little old guy. It's quite funny. He's like running around this modern mall. He's a little old dude with a beard and a toga. But he could have escaped, but it's a man of principle. He didn't. He stayed, and for that he paid with his life. Kind of like this Christ-like, this an analogy that's often been made, a Christ-like intellectual sacrifice, if you like, to the Athenian state, because he wouldn't cease his questioning, and eventually got to the point where he was put on trial for it on certain charges, but it was because of that, because he was pissing off a lot of important people, let's say, but he wouldn't subvert, let's say, the decision of the Athenian state, even if he didn't agree with it. And so the means of death was hemlock. So he had this poison, and he had to drink this hemlock, and very slow acting poison. And he was a bit too relaxed then, and he laid down, and the poison eventually worked its way to his heart, and then he died. So it's a story of a very quick overview of the story of Socrates. Just a really cool guy, like I say, not more of an intellectual giant, very big intellectual giant, incredibly influential on subsequent philosophy and Western philosophy. So yeah, and just that's pretty brave. So I'm fairly sure I wouldn't have the balls to have that kind of courage. I mean, it's quite difficult, isn't it? Imagine nowadays we see this a lot, or at least feigned indignation and the whole, you know what I'm getting at, like the whole woke thing. And today everyone's a hero and everyone's fighting for something, aren't they? But this is not to say that doesn't happen today sometimes in genuine cases, and that it hasn't happened in modern history further back. So like the civil rights movement, genuine situations where people did have the courage of their convictions and they were fighting prejudice. But to me, that really was like bloody brave. I mean, this is it's like I say, you're talking about an ancient time when things were just known and everyone knew that there were answers, there were gods. Everything was explained, at least to an extent, and a large proportion of the population would just know that things were a certain way. And to have the balls to question publicly as well, to go around questioning what people saw as gospel, or at least a lot of the time anyway, and then eventually to not back down and just say, no, this is what I believe, and that's that, and then to pay with it with his life is, to me, is as brave as like a Caesar running out into the front lines, and if you sort of face the scrutiny of the public sphere, to face that genuine prejudice, and to have the courage of your convictions is a very rare individual, and it's one of the reasons why you should love Socrates. It's directly answer the question. But yeah, Socrates, really interesting dude, a bit like Gaius Julius Caesar, definitely, and Alfred as well. Alfred must have had some kind of charisma, but Socrates, definitely. The weird thing about Socrates is that I don't know about Alfred. There's not really many notes about what he actually looked like. No one really knows what he looked like. There's a few descriptions of Caesar. He wasn't particularly stunning or anything like that. But Socrates has actually been noted to have been the opposite. So he wasn't good looking or anything. He was actually ugly. he was actually seen as ugly, and people took the piss out of him publicly, and he would just laugh along with it. And I think there was one story where him and this notably good-looking dude, one of his friends, were pissing about and having a beauty contest where they both try and get girls to kiss them, and then to see who was the most desirable or something. And Socrates just played along. He's quite a funny guy as well, by the sound of it. Anyway, he was notably ugly, and yet he had this magnetism about him. Obviously, otherwise he wouldn't have drawn such admiration and hatred at the same time. So maybe like a philosophical Thatcher or Trump kind of figure, maybe. It's a bit weird. Yeah, Socrates, very interesting dude. Very brave as well. You see lots of overlaps with these great individuals. So he was known to be quite brave as well, and fought in battles during the Peloponnesian War. So he was kind of like a private rank, and he was like a hoplite. They called them hoplites because of the hoplon shield. You had the old Greek phalanx. Anyway, he was a soldier as well, and was notably brave. And apparently, he supposedly saved the life of someone. I'll have to look it up because it's slipped my mind at the moment. But yeah, so Socrates, definitely look into him as well. But I think I'm going to wrap it up there because the video's probably gone on for quite a while now. But hopefully a nice long and juicy one for regulars of the channel. And if you're not, I hope you've enjoyed it, me rambling on, and have to do this again sometime. There's quite a few other people I could talk about. A few individuals, especially more my areas, more British history, English history, just because just what I've grown up with and read about, really. Yeah, I have to do it again sometime. And anyway, see you soon in the next one.